What I want to talk about today is the myth of NATO expansion and how it fuels Russia's war in Ukraine. So when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Vladimir Putin claimed that it was an act of self-defense response to NATO aggression, NATO expansion on Russia's doorstep. It was, according to the Kremlin, a preemptive strike to preserve Russian security and sovereignty. Now, this is something that's been obviously, as propaganda, it's been parroted out by a lot of Westerners and Russian sympathizers who just took it at face value and believed it without doing any kind of research on it. But this argument actually falls apart and under even mild scrutiny. Not only is there no evidence that NATO ever posed a military threat to Russia, but also the whole idea of NATO expansion is a deliberate distortion of history and one that ignores a lot of Russian behavior and the basic structure of NATO itself. In truth, the only aggression that Europe has actually seen in the past 3 decades has come from Moscow. So the NATO expansion claim is, Russia's geopolitical version of a childhood excuse. He made me do it. But it's kind of like the child that's caught throwing the first punch. So Russia insists that it was provoked, that the West forced it to invade Ukraine. Yet, when you look at it objectively, 4 years into the war, there's no Western or NATO government that's calling for an invasion of Russia. There's no Western tanks, Western armor crossing over into Russian territory. No NATO armors that are massing on the Russian border. No discussion from Western politicians on invading the Russian homeland. The only large-scale invasion that's occurred in Europe today is Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And at the heart of Russia's narrative lies a misrepresentation and a distortion of history. The claim that Western leaders promised Soviet officials in the early 90s that NATO would never expand eastwards. And this is something that you're going to hear quite often in the Russian propaganda. And the reality is the truth is far less supportive of Moscow's propaganda. And now that statement, NATO would not move eastward, emerged in the 1990s during negotiations after German reunification after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So the Soviet Union under Mikhail Gorbachev was understandably nervous that a unified Germany, which was a former wartime enemy, might rejoin NATO and station Western troops in former East German territory. So to ease Soviet fears, the US Secretary of State James Baker informally assured Gorbachev that NATO would not station non-German troops or nuclear weapons in the former East Germany once the country was unified. So this understanding was codified in the 1990 Treaty on the Final Settlement with respect to Germany, which allowed a unified Germany to remain in NATO but barred foreign NATO troops and nuclear weapons from being permanently based in the former East Germany. That's it. So that is where the statement comes from. It's specific to East Germany. That's it. In addition to this, there was no agreement, verbal or written, regarding NATO's presence in Eastern Europe, let alone the entire post-Soviet region. The alleged promise came from informal discussions, not a treaty. Baker's remarks on NATO's presence in Eastern Europe were never ratified by NATO nor by the US government, because the reality is he lacked any kind of authority to actually make a binding commitment on NATO's behalf. So he had as much authority to commit to something like that as you or I do. And in any case, as a lot of Soviet officials have later confirmed, former Soviet officials, including Gorbachev himself, no formal agreement was ever made restricting NATO's future membership. And even if such an agreement had been made, and it wasn't, it would have been made with the former Soviet Union, which dissolved in 1991. So the modern Russian Federation did inherit a lot of its predecessors' obligations. I'm talking about the Soviet Union, but not unilaterally and not in perpetuity for all successive states. So the claim that NATO violated an alleged promise that no evidence exists to support, made to a country that no longer exists, about territories that later became independent sovereign states, is legally and logically absurd. It should be noted that Russia did on several occasions mention or float the idea of joining NATO, but importantly, they never made any formal application, although Vladimir Putin did imply at one stage that Russia should be able to join NATO, but that they wouldn't have to go through the formal application process where NATO would be required to meet the same requirements as all other members did. And obviously that's not going to be accepted by NATO. So NATO membership would have required deep reforms inside Russia that Putin was unwilling or unable to make. And Russia also argued that they should have received special status, a special veto power. So they didn't see themselves as equals, they saw themselves as more important than the other member states. So NATO's position was consistent, that Russia could apply. They would have to meet the same democratic and military requirements as all other member states. So no vetoes, no special privileges, no special status. And obviously this was a deal breaker for the Kremlin. The newly independent states of newly independent nations of Central and Eastern Europe, such as Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, the Baltic states, and others, were not Soviet territory anymore. They were sovereign countries that freely applied to join NATO, motivated by one simple reason: fear of future Russian aggression. Now let's look at an agreement that was broken. That's the Budapest Memorandum. When Russia complains about a non-existent verbal promise from 1990, it has flagrantly violated a written and signed memorandum of its own, which is the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances. So under this document, Russia, the United States, and the UK guaranteed Ukraine's sovereignty and existing borders in exchange for Ukraine surrendering its arsenal, a nuclear arsenal, which at the time was the third largest in the world. So Russia explicitly agreed to respecting Ukraine's independence and borders, refraining from the threat of use of force against Ukraine, refraining from economic coercion, consulting in case of disputes that might arise. Unlike a defense pact, the Budapest Memorandum did not obligate the signatories to intervene militarily if Ukraine were attacked, but it did represent a solemn political commitment to uphold Ukraine's territorial integrity. So, very clear-cut agreement. By annexing Crimea in 2014 and again by invading Ukraine in 2022, Russia broke every single one of those assurances. So in short, Moscow violated a written document while accusing the West of breaking a non-existent verbal one. So even if one accepts the term NATO expansion, the phrase itself is misleading, because NATO doesn't expand like an empire. It doesn't coerce or force countries to join, occupy their land, install puppet governments, puppet regimes. Instead, NATO accepts applications from sovereign nations that seek to choose membership. The process requires democratic governance, civilian control of the military, respect for human rights, and every country that has joined NATO since the Cold War's end. So we're going back to Poland from 1999, right as recent as Finland in 2023, did so voluntarily and after public debate and parliamentary approval, discussion internally. These nations were not coerced. They were motivated by history and fear. So Russia's argument conveniently ignores why these countries wanted NATO membership in the first place. Because between 1945 and 1991, the Soviet Union forcibly occupied or dominated much of Central and Eastern Europe. And when the Soviet Union collapsed, its former satellite states remembered those decades of oppression and repression and saw how Russia retained the largest share of its old Soviet military. And then came Putin in the 2000s, who from early in the 2000s began consolidating power, silencing critics, expressing nostalgia for the Soviet Empire. His 2005 declaration that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century should be a warning to anybody in Europe. So is it any wonder the countries like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, which had suffered decades of Soviet occupation, rushed to join NATO at the first opportunity? So if NATO were truly threatening Russia, we would expect to see NATO armies on the offensive. Instead, every major European conflict since the Cold War has been initiated by Moscow. So even if you believe that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was meant to stop NATO enlargement, it backfired spectacularly, because before 2022, Finland and Sweden, who had long been neutral states, saw little reason to join NATO. But after witnessing the destruction of major cities in Ukraine like Mariupol, Bucha, Kharkiv, both nations concluded that neutrality was no longer safe. So Finland officially joined in 2023, ending 75 years of military non-alignment. Sweden joined shortly after in 2024, marking the alliance's most significant expansion in decades. If NATO is a defensive alliance, and it is, then the only reason Russia could view NATO membership as a threat is if it had planned to attack its neighbors. Article 5 of the NATO Treaty is explicit. Members are only obligated to defend one another if one is attacked. A NATO country cannot invoke the alliance to justify its own aggression. Thus, the only scenario in which NATO's presence on Russia's border poses a threat is one in which Russia intends to invade its neighbors, as it has repeatedly done. Now, I want to take a few moments to address three common rebuttals that I've often heard to what I've explained here. Firstly, is that NATO expanded aggressively towards Russia's borders and any country would feel threatened. This argument deliberately reverses cause and effect. NATO didn't expand towards Russia in a vacuum. Countries moved away from Russia because of Russia's own historical behavior. Every nation that joined NATO after the Cold War did so after decades of Soviet occupation, coercion, direct military intervention. So Poland, the Baltic states, and others didn't just wake up one day fearing Brussels. They lived in fear of Moscow, and they had a lived experience of that as a society. If NATO expansion were the cause of Russian aggression, we would expect to see NATO enlargements to precede Russian invasions. But history shows that the opposite is true. Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, seized Crimea in 2014, launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. NATO didn't move east. Eastern Europe ran west, seeking protection from a neighbor that had repeatedly used force to get its way. Secondly, that the West humiliated Russia after the Cold War and so broke its word, and Russia is just reacting. Poor Russia. They were isolated, they were made fun of, humiliated. And now this is one of the most persistent myths, and it's one that is supported by absolutely no evidence. Because Russia was not excluded from the post-Cold War security order. In fact, it actively was invited in. There was the Joint Partnership for Peace in 1994. There was the NATO Russia Founding Act in 1997. NATO participated in the NATO Russia Council from 2002 onwards, cooperated with NATO after 9/11, including intelligence sharing. And a lot of these agreements were signed with the explicit aim of trying to minimize the idea that that former Eastern European and former Central European countries or former Soviet countries had to join NATO for security. So the idea was that they wanted to, the Europeans at the time wanted to create this order where Russia was seen as a partner in security. There was cooperation across the board between Russia, former Soviet states, and NATO itself. And only when Russia started to see that this no longer suited them, this idea, this kind of equality, did these agreements actually start to break down. So the idea that Russia was cornered or betrayed ignores the reality that Russia was treated as an ally, as a potential partner, until it chose confrontation over cooperation. So what changed was not NATO's posture, but the Kremlin's priorities. And as power consolidated under Vladimir Putin, democratic reform gave way to authoritarian control, and foreign policy became a tool for regime survival. And when talking about foreign policy, I'm obviously talking about a lot of former Soviet states. Russia wasn't reacting to humiliation, it was rejecting a world in which its neighbors could choose their own future and be considered as equals. And the third one is that the third myth or the third rebuttal is that Ukraine was about to join NATO, so Russia had to act before it was too late. And the claim collapses the moment you actually look at the timeline, the history. So before 2014, NATO membership for Ukraine was politically unrealistic, and several NATO members openly opposed it. There was no membership action plan, there was no timetable, there was no consensus, there was no public support for it. And even after Russia annexed Ukraine, Crimea in 2014, NATO repeatedly stated that Ukrainian membership was not imminent. So ironically, it's only Russia's aggression that made NATO expansion more likely, not the other way around. If preventing NATO enlargement were the goal, invading Ukraine was the worst possible strategy. Not only did it increase NATO, the use case for NATO, it increased the NATO spending budget on military, it increased the size of NATO. The war inevitably pushed Ukraine towards the west, ended Finland and Sweden's neutrality, expanded NATO's border with Russia by over 1,300 kilometers. Russia didn't stop NATO, it accelerated exactly what it claimed to fear. So every pro-Russian aggression argument about NATO relies on the same sleight of hand, blaming other countries for reacting to Russia's actions while treating Russia's invasions as acts of destiny rather than choice. And ultimately, Russia's war on Ukraine is not about NATO, it's about empire. It's about reclaiming influence over former Soviet territories and extinguishing the idea of independent Slavic democracy next door to Russia. A stable, democratic, prosperous Ukraine aligned with the West would be an existential threat, not to Russia's security, but to Putin's regime, whose survival depends on authoritarian control and anti-Western paranoia. And that's why Moscow has invested decades in spreading disinformation about NATO, portraying itself as a victim rather than an aggressor. And it's not about protecting Russia's borders, it's about consolidating and protecting the Kremlin's power. And the facts tell a different story. NATO never promised not to expand beyond Germany. The Soviet Union, not Russia, was party to those discussions. And former Soviet states joined NATO voluntarily. They were not forced, they were not coerced, no pressure to protect themselves from future Russian invasions and aggression. And very importantly, Russia, not NATO, has repeatedly violated written agreements and invaded its neighbors and destabilized Europe. Russia's NATO expansion narrative is not just false, it's dangerous. It aims to sow division within Western and particularly European societies, fuel anti-government sentiment, and justify a war of conquest under the guise of self-defense. If you enjoy my content, I would appreciate if you could subscribe, and I will keep you updated on future videos. Thank you.